Marilyn Monroe, the American actress and beauty model who tragically had her life cut short. Back in the late 1950s and early 1960s, Marilyn Monroe was that girl. She became a popular romantic symbol, and anywhere she went, she had this unfathomable control over men. And out of the many men who were captivated by not just her looks, but also her beauty, was Frank Sinatra. Frank and Marilyn had a close bond, and this bond was often tagged an affair from time to time. Following the tragic cutting short of her life, there were debates about whether or not she took her own life by overdosing and whether she was murdered. But there was a final confession Frank Sinatra made that revealed something about Marilyn's tragic passing. Join us as we uncover what Frank Sinatra has finally revealed. Background on Marilyn Monroe. On June 1, 1926, at Los Angeles General Hospital, a baby girl who would one day captivate the world was born. Named Norma Jean Mortensen, she would later become the iconic Marilyn Monroe. But before the fame and Hollywood lights, her story began just like every other average person's. Her mother, Gladys Pearl Baker, was no stranger to struggle. Born in Piedras Negras, Mexico, to a poor Midwestern family that migrated to California, she endured a difficult childhood. At just 14 years old, she married John Newton Baker, a much older and abusive man. They had 2 children, Robert and Bernice, but the marriage was doomed from the get-go. Gladys filed for divorce in 1923 and won custody of the kids, only for Baker to kidnap them and flee to Kentucky. Marilyn wouldn't even learn she had a sister until she was 12 years old, and the two wouldn't meet until their late teens. Determined to move forward, Gladys found work as a film negative cutter at Consolidated Film Industries, and in 1924 she remarried Martin Edward Mortensen, but the marriage lasted only a few months, though it wasn't legally dissolved until 4 years later. When Norma Jean was born, Mortensen's name was put on her birth certificate, but most biographers believe her real father was Charles Stanley Gifford, Gladys's superior at RKO Studios, with whom Gladys had a brief affair in 1925. Although financially and emotionally unprepared to raise a child, Gladys ensured her daughter had a stable upbringing. She placed baby Norma Jean with Albert and Ida Bolender, a deeply religious foster couple in the quiet suburban town of Hawthorne, California. Gladys visited her daughter on weekends, but as time passed, her financial situation improved, and in 1933, she took out a loan to buy a small house in Hollywood. For the first time, 7-year-old Norma Jean lived with her mother, but this happiness was short-lived. In January 1934, tragedy struck when Gladys suffered a mental breakdown and was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. What began as a few months in a rest home turned into a lifetime of institutionalization. From that moment on, Norma Jean's world was thrown into chaos. With no stable guardian, she became a ward of the state. Her mother's close friend, Grace Goddard, stepped in to manage Gladys's affairs and took responsibility for young Norma Jean. But this was just the beginning of a childhood that would see her shuffled between foster homes, orphanages, and temporary guardians. In the summer of 1935, she briefly lived with her mother's close friend, Grace Goddard, and her husband, Irwin "Doc" Goddard, before being passed between other families. That September, Grace made a difficult decision. She placed 9-year-old Monroe in the Los Angeles Orphans' Home, No. 2, Hollygrove. The orphanage was well regarded, even praised as a model institution, but for a child who had already lost so much, it felt like yet another abandonment. Monroe longed for a family, and the staff at Hollygrove believed she would be better off in a home environment, but sadly, they were wrong. In 1936, Grace officially became her legal guardian, but Monroe remained in the orphanage for another year before being taken back into the Goddard household in the summer of 1937. Unfortunately, Her return was short-lived. After just a few months, she was forced to leave once again, this time because Doc Goddard allegedly molested her. From that point on, Monroe's childhood became a cycle of uncertainty. She was placed with distant relatives, family friends, and acquaintances in Los Angeles and Compton, never staying in one place for long. The instability and trauma of these years shaped Monroe's deep-seated fear of abandonment, her struggle to find a sense of belonging, and her lifelong search for love and acceptance, all of which would follow her long after she became the most famous woman in the world. All of this trauma birthed a need to escape, and so Marilyn Monroe's childhood dreams of becoming an actress were born. I didn't like the world around me because it was kind of grim. When I heard that this was acting, I said, that's what I want to be. Movies were her safe haven. Some foster families sent her to the theater just to get her out of the house, and she would sit there for hours, sometimes all day and into the night. Alone in the front row, staring up at the massive screen, she felt something: wonder, hope, maybe even a sense of belonging. By September 1938, Monroe found a bit more stability when she moved in with Grace Goddard's aunt, Anna Lower, in Sawtell. Anna was kind and deeply religious, taking Monroe to weekly Christian Science services. She enrolled in Emerson Junior High School, where she found she had a knack for writing and even contributed to the school newspaper. Still, school never really captured her interest, and she remained an average student. Her time with Anna brought some much-needed comfort, but it didn't last. As Anna's health declined, Monroe had to move back in with the Goddards in Van Nuys in early 1941, where she started attending Van Nuys High School. By 1942, another upheaval was on the horizon. Doc Goddard's job was transferring him to West Virginia, but California child protection laws wouldn't allow them to take Monroe out of state. She was faced with a choice: return to the orphanage or get married. At just 16 years old, she married James Dougherty, a 21-year-old factory worker and neighbor. The wedding took place on June 19, 1942, barely a week after her birthday. It wasn't a love story. It was survival. Monroe later admitted she was dying of boredom as a housewife. In 1943, Dougherty enlisted in the Merchant Marine, and they moved to Santa Catalina Island. But it didn't change how she felt. Deep down, she knew this life wasn't for her. With her husband shipped off to the Pacific in April 1944, Monroe found herself at a crossroads. She moved in with Dougherty's parents and took a job at the radio plane company, assembling drones for the war effort. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a taste of independence. Then fate, or a camera lens, stepped in. That same year, David Conover, a military photographer, was sent to the factory to capture the everyday women contributing to the war. He saw something in Monroe, a spark, a presence even, and though her photos weren't published, the experience planted a seed. By January 1945, she had walked away from factory work and into modeling. It wasn't easy. Her husband and mother-in-law disapproved, but Monroe didn't care. She moved out on her own and, by August 1945, had signed with the Blue Book Model Agency. High fashion wasn't in the cards. Her curves were more suited for pin-up work, but she took every opportunity she could. She dyed her hair platinum blonde, straightened her curls, and became one of the agency's top models. By early 1946, she had already graced 33 magazine covers. Modeling, though, was just the beginning. Through her agency, she signed with an acting representation in June 1946. Paramount wasn't interested, but 20th Century Fox took a chance. Executive Ben Lyons saw her potential and helped craft her new identity, Marilyn Monroe, a nod to Broadway star Marilyn Miller and her mother's maiden name, Monroe. By September 1946, her personal life had also taken a turn. Monroe divorced Dougherty. He wanted a housewife, and she wanted the world, and the world was what she got. At Fox, she threw herself into learning. She trained in acting, singing, and dancing, absorbing everything about filmmaking. Her first roles were tiny, bit parts in Dangerous Years, 1947, and Scudda Hoo, Scudda Hey, 1948. She craved something more, so the studio sent her to Actors Laboratory Theater, where she got her first taste of serious drama. But Hollywood wasn't convinced yet. They saw her as too shy, too insecure. In August 1947, Fox dropped her contract. Just like that, she was back to modeling and taking odd jobs, even working as a dancing pacer behind the scenes of musicals to help actors stay on beat just to survive. Still, she wasn't going to fade away. The name Marilyn Monroe had been spoken, and soon the world would remember it. Her persistence paid off in March 1948, when Fox executive Joseph M. Schenck, one of her admirers, pulled some strings. He convinced Columbia Pictures head, Harry Cohn, to give Monroe a chance. At Columbia, they remodeled her image, dyeing her hair a brighter platinum blonde and styling her after Rita Hayworth. She started working with Natasha Lytess, the studio's lead drama coach, who would remain her mentor for years. Monroe's only film at Columbia was the low-budget musical Ladies of the Chorus, 1948, where she had her first starring role as a chorus girl being courted by a wealthy man. She also screen-tested for the lead in Born Yesterday, 1950, but Columbia didn't see her as a star. With no studio backing her, Monroe went back to modeling. She shot a Pabst beer commercial and posed for nude photographs by Tom Kelly for a calendar under the name Mona Monroe. She had posed semi-nude before, so it wasn't a big deal for her, but it would later become part of her legend. Then, Johnny Hyde entered her life. A powerful Hollywood agent and vice president of William Morris Agency, he became Monroe's mentor, benefactor, and lover. Through Hyde, she secured small roles in several films, but two stood out. All About Eve, 1950, a drama directed by Joseph Mankiewicz, which earned 14 Academy Award nominations, and The Asphalt Jungle, 1950, a noir film by John Huston. Slowly but surely, Monroe was moving from a struggling actress to someone Hollywood was starting to notice. By December 1950, Monroe's career was finally gaining momentum. Johnny Hyde, her mentor and lover, secured her a 7-year contract with 20th Century Fox. It was a big break, but the contract gave Fox the option to drop her each year if they weren't satisfied. Just days later, Hyde suffered a fatal heart attack, leaving Monroe devastated. Despite her grief, Monroe kept working. In 1951, she appeared in 3 Fox comedies. She was mostly cast as eye candy, but critics started to take notice. Bosley Crowther of the New York Times called her superb in As Young as You Feel, and Ezra Goodman of the Los Angeles Daily News described her as one of the brightest up-and-coming actresses after Love Nest. Her popularity skyrocketed. She was receiving thousands of fan letters each week, and soldiers fighting in the Korean War made her their favorite pin-up girl. The Army newspaper Stars and Stripes even crowned her Miss Cheesecake of 1951. By February 1952, Monroe's rising star was officially recognized when the Hollywood Foreign Press Association named her Best Young Box Office Personality. Meanwhile, her personal life was just as eventful. She had a brief affair with director Elia Kazan and dated several high-profile men, including director Nicholas Ray and actors Yul Brynner and Peter Lawford. But in early 1952, she entered a headline-grabbing romance with retired New York Yankees baseball legend Joe DiMaggio, one of the most famous sports figures of the era. Later in March 1952, Monroe found herself caught in a scandal when news broke that she had posed nude for a calendar back in 1949. Instead of trying to hide it, she and 20th Century Fox decided to get ahead of the story. She admitted to the photos, but explained that she had been broke and struggling at the time. The move paid off. Public sympathy was on her side, and instead of damaging her career, it made her even more famous. She landed on the cover of Life magazine as the talk of Hollywood, and gossip columnist Hedda Hopper crowned her the Cheesecake Queen turned box office smash. With Monroe now a hot commodity, Fox rushed to release 3 films to capitalize on her skyrocketing popularity. Clash by Night, Don't Bother to Knock, We're Not Married. Even as Monroe embraced her image as a sex symbol, she wanted to prove she was more than just a pretty face. She started taking acting lessons with Michael Chekhov and mime Lotte Goslar. Her performance in Clash by Night, where she played a fish cannery worker, earned praise. The Hollywood Reporter said she deserves starring status with her excellent interpretation, and Variety called her a cinch for popularity. She also leaned into her bombshell image with some cheeky publicity stunts. She wore a daringly revealing dress as Grand Marshal at the Miss America pageant parade, and she told a gossip columnist she usually didn't wear underwear. By the end of 1952, Monroe was Hollywood's biggest new star, and columnist Floribel Muir officially declared her the It Girl of the Year. Marilyn Monroe didn't just turn heads, she captured hearts, including those of some of the most powerful men of her time. Presidents, musicians, and Hollywood legends all fell under her spell. But with power comes danger, and some believe one of these relationships sealed her fate. Marilyn Monroe's relationships with powerful men, from John F. Kennedy to Frank Sinatra, have been the subject of speculation, mystery, and legend. Some even believe that one of these relationships played a role in her untimely death on August 4, 1962. At first glance, Marilyn Monroe and Joe DiMaggio seemed like a Hollywood fairy tale, a glamorous movie star and a baseball legend. But their 9-month marriage in 1954 turned out to be anything but perfect. Their relationship began in 1952, when DiMaggio, who had just recently retired from the Yankees after winning 9 World Series, saw a photo of Monroe in a baseball outfit and was immediately love-stricken. He asked a friend to arrange a date, and they met at an Italian restaurant on Sunset Boulevard. Despite DiMaggio's being reserved, he barely spoke at dinner, and Monroe found herself drawn to him, later saying, "I expected a flashy New York sports type, and instead, I met this reserved guy who didn't make a pass at me right away." They married in January 1954 at San Francisco's City Hall, but their marriage scattered just as quickly as it began. DiMaggio disapproved of Monroe's Hollywood career, especially her roles that required revealing outfits and public attention. He wanted her to be a traditional housewife, which wasn't what Monroe wanted, given the fact that she tried to break from that cycle in her previous marriage to James Dougherty. According to Joe and Marilyn, legends in love, DiMaggio's jealousy and possessiveness escalated into physical abuse. One of the most infamous incidents occurred during the filming of Monroe's iconic white dress scene in The 7-Year Itch. As Monroe's dress floated over a subway grate, DiMaggio reportedly became enraged, leading to a violent confrontation when she returned home. Just 9 months after their wedding, Monroe filed for divorce in October 1954, citing mental cruelty. Despite their turbulent relationship, DiMaggio never stopped loving Monroe. When she passed away in 1962, it was DiMaggio, not Hollywood, not the Kennedys, who arranged her funeral. He even had fresh roses delivered to her grave 3 times a week for 20 years. According to biographers John and Rock Positano, he once confided, "I'll go to my grave regretting and blaming myself for what happened to her." While DiMaggio may have been her great love, Marilyn's marriage to playwright Arthur Miller in 1956 brought an entirely different kind of drama. As she filmed Bus Stop, Monroe fell for Miller, a literary genius who was deeply intellectual. Their relationship, however, didn't start off great. Miller was still married and facing accusations of communist ties, making their affair a public scandal. And this was just the beginning. As time would tell, Monroe's love life continued to be tangled in power and politics, all of which people believed led to her tragic passing. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Marilyn Monroe's marriage to Arthur Miller was supposed to be her happily ever after, a meeting of beauty and intellect, Hollywood and high art. Unlike her previous relationships, where she was often treated as a glamorous prize, Miller saw her as a person, or so she thought. She was drawn to the playwright because of his intelligence and the way he respected and saw just beyond her looks. In true Monroe fashion, their wedding was simple yet surprising. A 5-minute courthouse ceremony with only 2 witnesses, followed by an intimate reception at Miller's agent's home. No flashing cameras, no Hollywood spectacle. Just love, or at least what Monroe believed was love. But soon, reality hit hard and fast. Shortly after their wedding, the newlyweds traveled to England for the prince and the showgirl. Monroe, eager to prove herself as more than a blonde bombshell, saw this as an opportunity to shine. But instead, her eagerness didn't last long as she found something that shattered her. Miller's private notes, in which he confessed disappointment and embarrassment in their marriage. Shocking, right? For Monroe, who had idealized Miller as her intellectual soulmate, this was a slap in the face. Though there were moments of happiness, like when Miller dedicated a collection of his plays to her, but the damage was done after she found the note. By 1961, their love story had dissolved into a divorce. Then came Frank Sinatra, the old smooth-eyed candy with a smooth and velvety voice. Unlike her past lovers, Sinatra wasn't just another man drawn to Monroe's beauty. He saw beyond the Hollywood illusion. According to his close friend Tony Opedisano, Sinatra viewed Monroe as a fragile soul who had been exploited by too many people. Though he was undeniably attracted to her, his protectiveness kept him from making a move. Did Monroe and Sinatra ever truly become lovers? That's a question debated by biographers and close friends alike. But what's clear is that Sinatra was one of the few men in Monroe's life who saw the woman, not just the icon. Yet, even with powerful men in her orbit, Monroe's story was far from a fairy tale. And as history would have it, one relationship in particular would become the most infamous of all. Frank Sinatra's connection to Marilyn Monroe wasn't just another Hollywood fling. It was, by many accounts, a desperate attempt to save her from self-destruction. According to J. Randall Taraborelli's Sinatra, the man behind the myth, their alleged affair began in 1954, long before her life began spiraling. But by 1962, Monroe was a woman on the edge, and Sinatra, ever the protector, reportedly proposed to her in a last-ditch effort to help her. But if Sinatra's presence in Monroe's life was an open-ended question, her rumored relationship with President John F. Kennedy and his brother was wrapped in scandal. Their first introduction in 1954 was orchestrated by Peter Lawford, JFK's brother-in-law. Rumors of their affair exploded when Monroe took the stage in 1962 to deliver her now iconic breathy rendition of Happy Birthday, Mr. President. The performance was so sensual that even Jackie Kennedy refused to attend the event. Biographers remain divided on the extent of Monroe and JFK's relationship. James Spada claimed that after JFK had his fun, he passed her off to his brother, Robert F. Kennedy. But Donald Soto offered a more measured take, insisting that the two only met 4 times between October 1961 and August 1962. Yet, it wasn't just whispers of an affair that made Monroe's final days so ominous. It was her alleged threat to expose the Kennedy brothers. In the weeks before her death, Monroe was reportedly planning a press conference to reveal her relationship with both JFK and Robert Kennedy. Netflix's documentary, The Mystery of Marilyn Monroe, The Unheard Tapes, even suggests that she had been impregnated by one of the brothers, a secret that some believe was too dangerous to keep. Then, just days before she died, she made one final shocking confession. She planned to marry Bobby Kennedy. Whether her death was a tragic overdose or something far more sinister remains one of history's greatest mysteries. Frank Sinatra's confession about Marilyn Monroe. They were two of the most famous people in the world, icons of an era where glamour and scandal walked hand in hand. Marilyn Monroe, the dazzling blonde bombshell with a smile that could melt hearts and a sadness she could never quite hide. And Frank Sinatra, the blue-eyed crooner with a velvet voice, a bad temper, and enough charm to bend the world to his will. For 7 years, they had been locked in a secret love affair, hidden from the prying eyes of Hollywood. But in 1961, their clandestine romance was about to become something more. Marriage was on the table. Sinatra, ever the protector, had seen Monroe as more than a sex symbol. He saw her fragility, her loneliness, and perhaps even a reflection of his own struggles. But then, on a fateful night in Las Vegas, she made a mistake he could never forgive. She had taken her seat front and center at the Sands Casino, a vision in a plunging gown, her bare shoulders catching the stage lights. Next to her sat Hollywood royalty, Elizabeth Taylor, Dean Martin, the kind of audience Sinatra lived for. But, as the night went on, Monroe's world blurred. Barbiturates, washed down with Dom Perignon, loosened her grip on reality. She swayed in her seat, laughing too loudly, her dress slipping dangerously. And then it happened. Monroe, in that moment, had shattered the illusion. And so, in the same breath that he had once considered making her his wife, he decided against it. The wedding plans were over. But the affair? That wasn't so easy to end. Even after their romance faded, Monroe and Sinatra remained tangled in each other's lives, bound by something deeper than passion, an understanding of what it meant to be both adored and utterly alone. Yet, their relationship was just one thread in a web of dangerous entanglements. Monroe wasn't just involved with Sinatra. She was also tangled up with President John F. Kennedy, his brother, Robert Kennedy, and her possessive ex-husband, baseball legend Joe DiMaggio. Sinatra, always a man who played his cards carefully, knew better than to get caught in the crossfire. He was terrified of DiMaggio, a man taller, stronger, and known to have mafia ties. He was wary of the Kennedys, whose power stretched beyond what even Sinatra could influence. A marriage with Monroe wouldn't just be a romantic risk, it could be a death sentence. And yet, through it all, they remained lovers in secret. She called him Frankie. He called her Norma Jean. When they were together, they could drop their masks. Sinatra, always the tough guy, let his guard down enough to remove his toupee in front of her. Monroe, always the glamorous seductress, found comfort in a man who didn't just see her as a fantasy. In his own way, Frank was as emotionally fragile as she was, author Ed Epstein wrote. They were, in many ways, each other's analysts. But Monroe's demons ran deeper than Sinatra's love could fix. By the time Monroe died in 1962 from an overdose, their love affair had long since faded into history. But the whispers never stopped. Some said she had been silenced because she knew too much, about the Kennedys, about the secrets of the men who had loved her. Others believed she had simply lost her battle with herself. What was undeniable was this: Monroe and Sinatra were never meant to be, not in the public eye, not in marriage. But for a time, in the shadows of Hollywood, they had been each other's escape. Monroe and Sinatra had first met in 1953 at a pivotal moment in both of their careers. Monroe had become a true Hollywood star with Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, while Sinatra, whose career had hit rock bottom, had just made a triumphant comeback, winning an Oscar for From Here to Eternity. However, some of Monroe's friends had warned her against getting involved with Sinatra. Actress Shelley Winters recalled telling Monroe to stay away from him. "Talk about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. He can scare the hell out of you." Similarly, band leader Tommy Dorsey cautioned, "Frank is the most fascinating man in the world, but don't stick your hand in the cage." But Monroe didn't heed their warnings. Their romance might have become public had their joint plans for a film and concert tour materialized. They had been set to co-star in The Girl in Pink Tights, but Monroe dropped out upon learning that she would be paid less than a third of Sinatra's salary. Plans for other films, including Guys and Dolls and a remake of A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, also fell through. Sinatra invited Monroe to join him on a world tour, but she declined, wary of DiMaggio's jealousy. Still, Sinatra showered Monroe with gifts, including a private yacht trip, diamond and emerald earrings, a fur coat, and a white poodle she named Maff, in reference to Sinatra's alleged mafia ties. Monroe adored Sinatra's singing, frequently playing his records at home. Epstein recounted that Monroe had once told a friend that Sinatra was a generous lover, but she admitted, "He's no Joe," referring to DiMaggio. Throughout their relationship, both Monroe and Sinatra had other lovers. Monroe was involved with Marlon Brando and later married playwright Arthur Miller, while Sinatra had romances with Gloria Vanderbilt and was briefly engaged to Lauren Bacall. In his later years, Sinatra frequently reminisced about the loves and losses of his life, including Monroe. However, the circumstances surrounding Monroe's death on August 4, 1962, from an alleged drug overdose, remained a mystery. Sinatra's close friend and former road manager, Tony Opedisano, claimed in his memoir, Sinatra and Me, in the wee small hours, that Sinatra never believed Monroe's death was an accident. "Frank believed she was murdered," Opedisano wrote, "and he never got over it." Interestingly, Opedisano disputed the long-held belief that Monroe and Sinatra were lovers. He insisted that while they were close friends, Sinatra never pursued a physical relationship with her. Frank felt she was too troubled, too fragile for him to sleep with, and then walk away, he wrote. She did, however, confide in Sinatra about her most intimate secrets, including her affairs with John F. Kennedy and Robert F. Kennedy. When those affairs ended abruptly, she was left confused and hurt. Marilyn told Frank she didn't understand why they'd shut her out completely once she stopped having sex with them, Opedisano wrote. The weekend before her death, Monroe stayed at the famous Cal Neva Lodge near Lake Tahoe, which was partially owned by Sinatra. At the time, the public assumed she was there with Sinatra, but according to Opedisano, she was actually spending time with her ex-husband, Joe DiMaggio, who was staying nearby. Monroe had reportedly decided to make a public announcement the following week that she and DiMaggio were getting back together. This planned press conference started rumors that Monroe was going to reveal details of her relationships with JFK and RFK. However, Opedisano insists that wasn't true. Frank said she'd never have spilled about the Kennedys because she still had feelings for Jack. But Sinatra believed that the mere announcement of the press conference had sealed her fate. Frank believed if the press conference hadn't been announced, she would have lived a lot longer. What do you think really happened to Marilyn Monroe? Within days of Monroe's death, Sinatra's attorney, Mickey Rudin, who also worked with Monroe, told him that she had been killed. Similar rumors were circulating among mob boss Sam Giancana's men, some of whom even claimed involvement. According to Opedisano, Sinatra had multiple sources who told him the same chilling story. She'd been murdered with a Nembutal suppository, and Robert Kennedy or the mob was involved. Even over 5 decades later, the truth behind Monroe's death remains a mystery. Conspiracy theories abound, and I can't lay them to rest, Opadisano admitted. What is certain, though, is that Sinatra was haunted by her death. In his later years, he often reminisced about Monroe, along with other lost friends like his Rat Pack companions, Sammy Davis Jr. and Dean Martin. Many of those late-night conversations took place at his beloved Palm Springs compound, where he shared stories until dawn. Do you think Monroe was murdered? Or do you think otherwise? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more fascinating stories.